Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I am reading you a book. We are reading Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope, and we are very nearly at the end. We're in chapter 52. We are going to dispense with the last few moving parts and pieces of Trollope's various plot lines. This chapter is called The New Dean Takes Possession of the Deanery and the New Warden of the Hospital. Mr. Harding and the Archdeacon together made their way to Oxford, and there, by dint of cunning argument, they induced the Master of Lazarus also to ask himself this most momentous question: why should not Mr. Arabin be Dean of Barchester? He, of course, for a while tried his hand at persuading Mr. Harding that he was foolish, overscrupulous, self-willed, and weak-minded, but he tried in vain. If Mr. Harding would not give way to Dr. Grantley, it was not likely he would give way to Dr. Gwynne, more especially now that so admirable a scheme was that of inducting Mr. Arabin into the deanery had been set on foot. When the master found that his eloquence was in vain, and heard also that Mr. Arabin was about to become Mr. Harding's son-in-law, he confessed that he would, under such circumstances, be glad to see his old friend and protege, the fellow of his college, placed in the comfortable position that was going a-begging. "It might be the means, you know, master, of keeping Mr. Slope out," said the Archdeacon, with grave caution. "He has no more chance of it," said the master, "than our college chaplain. I know more about it than that." Mrs. Grantley had been right in her surmise. It was the Master of Lazarus who had been instrumental in representing in high places the claims which Mr. Harding had upon the government, and he now consented to use his best endeavors towards getting the offer transferred to Mr. Arabin. The three of them went to London together, and there they remained for a week, to the great disgust of Mrs. Grantley, and most probably also of Mrs. Gwynne. The minister was out of town in one direction, and his private secretary in another. The clerks who remained could do nothing in such a matter as this, and all was difficulty and confusion. The two doctors seemed to have plenty to do. They bustled here and bustled there, and complained at their club in the evenings that they had been driven off their legs. But Mr. Harding had no occupation. Once or twice he suggested that he might perhaps return to Barchester. His request, however, was peremptorily refused, and he had nothing for it but to while away his time in Westminster Abbey. "You could go to the library." At length an answer from the great man came. The Master of Lazarus had made his proposition through the Bishop of Belgravia. Now this bishop, though but newly gifted with his diocesan honors, was a man of much weight and in the clerico-political world. He was, if not pious, at any rate as wise as St. Paul, and had been with so much effect in all things to all men, that though he was great among the dons of Oxford, he had been selected for the most favourite seat of the bench by a Whig prime minister. To him Dr. Gwynne had made known his wishes and his arguments, and the bishop had made them known to the Marquis of Kensington Core. Marquis, who was Lord High Steward of the Pantry Board, and who by most men was supposed to hold the highest office out of the cabinet, trafficked much in affairs of this kind. He not only suggested the arrangement to the minister over a cup of coffee, standing on the drawing-room rug at Windsor Castle, but he also favourably mentioned Mr. Arabin's name in the ear of a distinguished person. And so the matter was arranged. And here, this is all very comfortable. This is at the end of the Warden, or the Barchester Towers, so this is wrapping up action that's supposed to be glowing with warmth and affection. But still there are satirical jabs here. You won't get them, because they're a century old now. But there is a bit of a satirical bite here. There would have been to Trollope's contemporary readers, about how these things are arranged, about what a worldly way in which these things are arranged. And so the matter was arranged. The answer of the great man came, and Mr. Arabin was made Dean of Barchester. The three clergymen who had come up to town on this important mission dined together with great glee on the day on which the news reached them. In a silent, decent, clerical manner, they toasted Mr. Arabin with full bumpers of claret. The satisfaction of all of them was supreme. The Master of Lazarus had been successful in his attempt, and success is dear to us all. The Archdeacon had trampled upon Mr. Slope, and had lifted to high honours the young clergyman whom he had induced to quit the retirement and comfort of the university. So at least the Archdeacon thought, though, to speak the sooth, not he, but circumstances had trampled on Mr. Slope. But the satisfaction of Mr. Harding was, of all, perhaps the most complete. He laid aside his usual melancholy manner, and brought forth little quiet jokes from the inmost mirth of his heart. He poked his fun at the Archdeacon about Mr. Slope's marriage, and quizzed him for his improper love of Mrs. Proudie. On the following day they all returned to Barchester. It was arranged that Mr. Arabin should know nothing of what had been done till he received the minister's letter from the hands of his embryo father-in-law. In order that no time might be lost, a message has been sent to him by the preceding night's post, begging him to be at the deanery at the hour that the train from London arrived. There was nothing in this which surprised Mr. Arabin. It had somehow got about through all Barchester that Mr. Harding was the new dean, and all Barchester was prepared to welcome him with pealing bells and full hearts. Mr. Slope had certainly had a party. There had certainly been those in Barchester who were prepared to congratulate him on his promotion with assumed sincerity, but even his own party was not heartbroken by his failure. The inhabitants of the city, even the high-souled, ecstatic young ladies of 35, had begun to comprehend that their welfare and the welfare of the place was connected in some mysterious manner with daily chants and bi-weekly anthems. The expenditure of the palace had not added much to the popularity of the bishop's side of the question, and on the whole there was a strong reaction. When it became known to all the world that Mr. Harding was to be the new dean, all the world rejoiced heartily, because they're not liking a lot of these reforms that Mr. Slope was bringing in. Mr. Arabin, we have said, was not surprised at the summons which called him to the deanery. He had not as yet seen Mr. Harding since Eleanor had accepted him, nor had he seen him since he had learnt his father-in-law's preferment. There was nothing more natural, more necessary, than that they should meet each other at the earliest possible moment. Mr. Arabin was waiting in the deanery parlor when Mr. Harding and Dr. Grantley were driven up from the station. There was some excitement in the bosoms of all of them as they met and shook hands, by far too much to enable either of them to begin his story and tell it in a properly equitable style of narrative. Mr. Harding was some minutes quite dumbfounded, and Mr. Arabin could only talk in short, spasmodic sentences about his love and good fortune. He slipped in, as best he could, some sort of congratulation about the deanship, and then went on with his hopes and fears, hopes that he might be received as a son, and fears that he hardly deserved such good fortune. Then he went back to the dean. It was the most thoroughly satisfactory appointment, he said, of which he had ever heard. But, said Mr. Harding, and then, failing to get any further, he looked imploringly at the Archdeacon. The truth is, Arabin, said the doctor, that after all you are not destined to be the son-in-law to a dean. Nor am I, either, more's the pity. Mr. Arabin looked at him for explanation. Is not Mr. Harding to be the new dean? It appears not, said the Archdeacon. Arabin's face fell a little, and he looked from one to the other. It was plain to be seen from them that there was no cause of unhappiness in the matter, at least not of unhappiness to them, but there was as yet no elucidation of the mystery. Think how old I am, said Mr. Harding, imploringly. Fiddlestick, said the Archdeacon. That's all very well, but it won't make a young man of me, said Mr. Harding. And who is to be the dean, said Mr. Arabin. Yes, that's the question, said the Archdeacon. Come, Mr. Presenter, since you obstinately refuse to be anything else, let us know who is to be the man. He has got the nomination in his pocket. With eyes brimful of tears, Mr. Harding produced out the letter and handed it to his future son-in-law. He tried to make a little speech, but failed altogether. Having given up the document, he turned round to the wall, feigning to blow his nose, and then sat himself down on the old dean's dingy horsehair sofa. Here we find it necessary to bring our account of the interview to an end. Nor can we pretend to describe the rapture which Mr. Harding had received by his daughter. She wept with grief and wept with joy, with grief that her father should, in his old age, still be without that rank and worldly position which, according to her ideas, he had so well earned, and with joy that he, her darling father, should have bestowed on that other dear one good things of which he himself would not open his hand to take possession. And here Mr. Harding again showed his weakness. In the midst of this espousal of their loves and reciprocal affection, he found himself unable to resist the entreaties of all parties that the lodgings in the High Street should be given up. They can't stand the fact that he lives over a chemist's shop. Eleanor would not live in the deanery, she said, unless her father lived there also. Mr. Arabin would not be dean unless Mr. Harding would be co-dean with him. The Archdeacon declared that his father-in-law should not have his own way in everything, and Mrs. Grantley carried him off to Plumstead that he might remain there till Mr. and Mrs. Arabin were in a state to receive him in their own mansion. Unlike Eleanor's house, remember, Eleanor was insisting that her father live with her, but unlike her house, the deanery is big. There's plenty of room. Pressed by such arguments as these, what could a weak old man do but yield? But there was yet another task which it behooved Mr. Harding to do before he could allow himself to be at rest. Little has been said in these pages of the state of those remaining old men who had lived under his sway at the hospital. But not on this account must it be presumed that he had forgotten them, that in their state of anarchy and in their want of due government he had omitted to visit them. He visited them constantly. and had latterly given them to understand that they would soon be required to subscribe their adherence to a new master. There were now but 5 of them, one having been but quite lately carried to his rest, but 5 of the full number, which had hitherto been 12, and which was now to be raised to 24, including women. Of these, old Bunce, who for many years had been the favorite of the late warden, was one. Abel Handy, who had been the humble means of driving that warden from his house, had been another. These are characters from the warden that we met. You can go and find that read-through. Mr. Harding now resolved that he himself would introduce the new warden to the hospital. He felt that many circumstances might conspire to make the men receive Mr. Quiverful with aversion and disrespect. He felt also that Mr. Quiverful might himself feel the qualms of conscience as he entered the hospital, with an idea that he did so in hostility to its predecessor. Mr. Harding therefore determined to walk in arm with Mr. Quiverful, and to ask from these men their respectful obedience to their new master. On returning to Barchester, he found that Mr. Quiverful had not yet slept in the hospital house, and entered on his new duties. He accordingly made known to that gentleman his wishes, and his proposition was not rejected. It was a bright, clear morning, though in November, that Mr. Harding and Mr. Quiverful, arm in arm, walked through the hospital gate. It was one trait in our friend's character that he did nothing with parade. He omitted, even in the most important things of his life, that sort of parade by which most of us deem it necessary to grace our important doings. We have housewarmings, christenings, and gala days. We keep, if not our own birthdays, then those of our children. We are apt to fuss over ourselves if called upon to change our residences, and have, almost all of us, our little state occasions. Mr. Harding had no state occasions. When he left his old house, he went forth from it with the same quiet composure as though he had merely taken his daily walk. And now that he had re-entered it with another warden under his wing, he did so with the same quiet step and calm demeanor. He was a little less uptight than he had been 5 years, nay, it was now nearly 6 years ago. He walked perhaps a little slower. His footfall was perhaps thought less firm. Otherwise, one might have said that he was merely returning with a friend under his arm. This friendliness was everything to Mr. Quiverful. To him, even in his poverty, the thought that he was supplanting a brother clergyman so kind and so courteous as Mr. Harding was yet very bitter. Under his circumstance, it had been impossible for him to refuse the proffered boon. He could not reject the bread that was offered to his children, or refuse to ease the heavy burden that had so long oppressed that poor wife of his. Nevertheless, it had been very grievous to him to think that in going to the hospital he might encounter the ill will of his brethren in the diocese. All this Mr. Harding had fully comprehended. It was for feelings such as these, for the nice comprehension of such motives, that his heart and intellect were peculiarly fitted. In most matters of worldly import, the Archdeacon had set down his father-in-law as little better than a fool. And perhaps he was right. But in some other matters, equally important if they be rightly judged, Mr. Harding, had he been so minded, might with as much propriety have set down his son-in-law for a fool. Few men, however, are constituted as was Mr. Harding. He had that nice appreciation of the feelings of others which belongs right exclusively to women. Arm in arm they walked into the inner quadrangle of the building, and there the 5 old men met them. Mr. Harding shook hands with them all, and then Mr. Quiverful did the same. With Bunce, Mr. Harding shook hands twice, and Mr. Quiverful was about to repeat the same ceremony when the old man gave him no encouragement. "I am very glad to know that at last you have a new warden," said Mr. Harding in a very cheery voice. "We be very old for change," said one of them. "We do suppose it all for the best." "Certainly, certainly it is for the best," said Mr. Harding. "You will again have a clergyman of your own church under the same roof with you, and a very excellent clergyman you will have. It is a great satisfaction to me to know that so good a man is coming to take care of you, and that it is no stranger but a friend of my own, who will allow me from time to time to come in and see you." "We be very thankful to your reverence," said another of them. "I need not tell you, my good friend," said Mr. Quiverful, "how extremely grateful I am to Mr. Harding for his kindness to me. I must say his uncalled for, his unexpected kindness." "He be always very kind," said a third. "What I can do to fill the void which he has left here, I will do. For your sake and my own I will do so, and especially for his sake. But to you who have known him, I can never be so well beloved a friend and father as he has been." "No, sir, no," said old Bunce, who hitherto had held his peace. "No one can be that. Not if the new bishop sent a hangle out of heaven, that's angel. Who doesn't doubt you'll do your best, sir, but you'll not be like the old master, not for us old ones." "Fie, Bunce, fie, how dare you talk in that way," said Mr. Harding, but as he scolded the old man, he held him by his arm and pressed it with warm affection. There was no getting up any enthusiasm in the matter. How could 5 old men, tottering away to their final resting place, be enthusiastic on the reception of a stranger? What could Mr. Quiverful be to them, or they to Mr. Quiverful? Had Mr. Harding indeed come back to them, some last flicker of joyous light might have shone forth on their aged cheeks. But it was in vain to bid them rejoice because Mr. Quiverful was about to take his 14 children from Puddingdale into the hospital house. In reality, they did no doubt receive advantage, spiritual as well as corporal, but this they could not anticipate nor acknowledge. It was a dull affair enough, this introduction of Mr. Quiverful, but still it had its effect. The good which Mr. Harding intended to do did not fall to the ground. All the Barchester world, including the 5 old bedesmen, treated Mr. Quiverful with more respect because Mr. Harding had waded arm in arm with him on his first entrance to his duties. And here in this new abode we shall leave Mr. and Mrs. Quiverful and their 14 children. May they enjoy the good things which Providence has at length given to them. So now we're done with that. Mr. Harding has said goodbye to the hospital. The whole plot of The Warden has now reached its final close. He's moving into a dignified, wonderful mansion. The bedesmen are as contented as they can be. Mr. Quiverful and Mrs. Quiverful and their 14 children, I guess, will perpetually be drugs on the market. They won't go out and earn any money of their own. I guess there's just going to be 14 children forever. They're all moved in. So it's another huge plot of this story that is laid to rest. So we have very little left to do. And we'll do that next time. So I will wrap this up for now, and I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.